America, late 1930s. Steel, distance, and raw ambition. The Great Depression still haunted the nation, but freight never stopped moving. Coal, steel, food, and war materials all had to cross one brutal obstacle: the Rocky Mountains. Diesel power wasn't ready yet. Roads were slow. Rail was king. Union Pacific faced a problem no ordinary engine could solve. So they built a monster, the biggest steam locomotive ever to touch steel rails. This is the rise and fall of the Union Pacific Big Boy. 1. America before the Big Boy. By the 1930s, the United States was already bound together by rail, but that unity came at a cost. Distance in America wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in strain. Long freight trains hauled coal, grain, steel, and machinery across thousands of miles, and nowhere was that strain more obvious than in the American West. Union Pacific's main artery ran through the Wasatch Range, a section of track that punished engines and crews alike. Steep grades, high altitude, brutal winters, and relentless schedules turned every climb into a battle. Trains slowed to a crawl, helper locomotives were added, then added again. Crews worked harder, fuel burned faster, and delays stacked up. The railroad was efficient by the standards of the time, but efficiency wasn't enough anymore. America was industrializing at full throttle, and Union Pacific needed its trains to move faster, heavier, and more reliably than ever before. The nation didn't want incremental progress. It wanted dominance over geography. And that meant confronting a problem no existing locomotive could truly solve, forcing engineers to ask an uncomfortable question about scale, power, and whether the limits of steam had actually been reached yet. That question would soon demand an answer far larger than anyone expected. 2. A problem too big for normal engines. Union Pacific's engineers understood the math, and the math was unforgiving. The Wasatch grades required immense tractive effort, sustained speed, and reliability under constant stress. Existing steam locomotives could do one or two of those things well, but never all three at once. The solution had always been helpers. Add more engines, add more crews, add more fuel. But helpers slowed operations, complicated logistics, and quietly drained profits. Every extra locomotive was a workaround, not a victory. Union Pacific didn't want assistance, they wanted independence. Their demand was blunt: a single locomotive capable of hauling 3,600 tons up a 1.14% grade at 40 miles per hour without help. At the time, that sounded less like a specification and more like a dare. Most railroads would have compromised, reduced speed, reduced load. Union Pacific refused. They believed the problem wasn't the mountain, it was the mindset. If existing engines couldn't do the job, then the job required something entirely new. Something designed not around limits, but around excess. And so the railroad turned to builders who weren't afraid of impossible drawings and dangerous ambitions. What followed wasn't an improvement, it was a complete redefinition. 3. Designing the impossible. The American Locomotive Company took Union Pacific's demands and pushed them to their breaking point. The result was not subtle. It was massive, unapologetic, and terrifyingly precise. The 4884 wheel arrangement told the story instantly. 2 sets of 8 driving wheels delivered immense traction, while articulation allowed the engine to bend through curves that should have defeated something so long. The boilers stretched endlessly, feeding steam to cylinders that dwarfed those of ordinary locomotives. The firebox alone could burn over 5 tons of coal at a time. At full output, the engine produced more than 6,000 horsepower, with enough tractive effort to move entire towns' worth of freight in one pull. Fully loaded, the machine weighed over 1.2 million pounds. Yet it wasn't crude. Every measurement mattered. Balance, flexibility, and durability were engineered into every component. This wasn't brute force pretending to be engineering. It was engineering weaponized. Someone chalked Big Boy on one of the first engines during construction. The name stuck because nothing else fit, and soon this impossible design would face the mountains that inspired it. 4. When the giant rolled out. In 1941, the first of the new locomotives entered service, and everything about them felt unreal. Yard crews stopped what they were doing just to stare. Engineers approached with caution. This wasn't just another engine added to the roster, it was something closer to a moving landmark. Once coupled to a freight train, the big boy revealed its true purpose. It didn't strain, it didn't hesitate. Where earlier locomotives clawed uphill with slipping wheels and screaming boilers, this one simply leaned forward and went. Helper engines, once mandatory, were suddenly unnecessary. Schedules tightened, bottlenecks vanished. At speed, the sensation was unforgettable. The exhaust thundered in deep rhythmic blasts, echoing off canyon walls. Towns shook as it passed. Rail workers said you didn't hear a big boy approach. You felt it first, like distant weather rolling in. Despite its size, it handled smoothly, bending through curves with controlled confidence. This wasn't excess for spectacle, it was excess with purpose. Union Pacific had not just solved a problem, they had rewritten the rules of what a locomotive could be. But the true test of this giant was still ahead, and history was about to demand everything it had. 5. War, work, and the peak of steam. World War II pushed American railroads beyond anything they had ever experienced. Freight volumes exploded overnight. Troops, tanks, ammunition, food, and fuel all moved by rail, and delays were no longer inconvenient. They were unacceptable. The big boy thrived in this pressure. It ran hard and constantly, often covering long mountain stretches without pause. Crews respected it because it delivered. Maintenance teams learned its rhythms, its moods, its limits. For a machine so large, it proved remarkably dependable. This was steam power at its absolute peak. The big boy represented decades of refinement compressed into one final, towering expression. Every lesson learned since the early days of railroading lived inside its steel frame. At full throttle, it embodied American industrial confidence, the belief that any obstacle could be overcome by building something bigger, stronger, and more determined than the problem itself. But even as the big boy carried the weight of a nation at war, something quieter was happening elsewhere on the rails. A new kind of power was warming up in the background, and it didn't need fire, water, or spectacle to change everything. 6. The world begins to change. While the big boy ruled the mountains, diesel-electric locomotives were quietly proving themselves elsewhere. They didn't roar or breathe steam. They didn't need hours to prepare for a run. Turn the key, and they were ready. Diesels required fewer crew members, less maintenance, and far less downtime. Multiple units could be linked together and controlled by a single engineer, scaling power without scaling complexity. To railroad accountants, this wasn't innovation. It was inevitability. Compared to diesels, steam locomotives looked suddenly fragile. They demanded constant attention, massive infrastructure, and armies of skilled workers. The big boy, magnificent as it was, represented the ultimate expression of a system nearing the end of its usefulness. Union Pacific began transitioning. New diesels arrived. Steam assignments shrank. The giant that once symbolized progress now felt like a relic still doing its job too well to ignore. The big boy wasn't failing. The world was simply moving on. And for a machine built to conquer mountains, that realization would prove more dangerous than any grade it ever climbed. The fall of the giant would come not from weakness, but from replacement. 7. The fall of a Titan retirement didn't come with drama. There was no final heroic run, no ceremony, no farewell whistle echoing through the mountains. It came quietly, through memos and schedules and numbers on a balance sheet. By the late 1950s, diesel-electric locomotives had proven themselves cheaper, faster to deploy, and far easier to maintain. They didn't need water towers, coal docks, or hours of preparation. They simply worked. And in a business measured in efficiency, that mattered more than awe. The big boy was still powerful, still capable, still unmatched in raw steam performance. But its very greatness worked against it. Too large, too specialized, too labor-intensive for a railroad now obsessed with flexibility. In 1959, Union Pacific officially retired the class. Some engines were stored, briefly waiting for a reprieve that never came. Others were cut apart where they stood, their steel reduced to scrap, their legend erased in sparks and silence. There was no failure here, only replacement. The most powerful steam locomotive ever built hadn't been defeated by mountains or loads, but by a new way of thinking. And yet, as the torches went out and the rails fell quiet, the story of the big boy was far from over. Because giants once built are hard to forget. 8. From scrap to legend. Most big boys didn't survive the transition to the diesel age. Their steel was too valuable, their size too impractical to store indefinitely. One by one, they disappeared, dismantled into anonymous raw material for a future that no longer needed them. But 8 were spared, placed in parks, museums, and rail yards across the country. They became monuments rather than machines. Frozen mid-stride, they invited disbelief. People stood beside them and struggled to understand the scale. Driving wheels taller than a grown adult, pistons thicker than torsos, boilers that felt more like buildings than engines. Up close, the big boy wasn't just large, it was overwhelming. For decades, that's where the story paused, a relic of steam's final defiant moment, a reminder of what American engineering once dared to attempt. Then, unexpectedly, Union Pacific made a decision no one saw coming. They chose not to preserve history quietly. They chose to wake it up. And when the giant moved again, the modern world stopped to watch. 9. The giant lives again. In 2019, Union Pacific restored Big Boy number 4014 to full operating condition. Not as a display, not as a static tribute, but as a living, breathing machine. When it steamed again, crowds gathered by the thousands. Entire towns shut down just to see it pass. People lined tracks with phones raised, then lowered them, realizing some moments demanded silence instead. The sound hadn't changed. Deep, heavy exhaust beats rolled across the landscape like distant thunder. The ground vibrated, the air filled with steam and oil and memory. For younger generations, it felt unreal. For older ones, it felt impossible. A machine from another century moving through a world of satellites and screens. This wasn't nostalgia for its own sake. It was proof. Proof that engineering once chased extremes, that progress once looked like risk, weight, fire, and steel. And that even in retirement, the big boy still commanded respect. Because when the largest steam locomotive in history moves, it doesn't ask for attention, it takes it. And with that, the legend completed its circle, from dominance to silence to awe once more. 10. The legacy of the big boy. The Union Pacific big boy didn't create the future of railroading. Diesel power did that, but it defined the absolute limit of what steam could achieve, and that alone makes it unforgettable. This was engineering without restraint, a machine built not to compromise but to conquer. It solved a problem so completely that nothing bigger ever needed to exist. In doing so, it marked the end of an era as clearly as it marked its peak. The big boy stands today as a reminder that progress is not always about efficiency. Sometimes it is about proving what is possible when ambition outweighs caution. When builders push a technology to its final, breathtaking expression, it was never meant to last forever. It was meant to go all the way. And it did. When people stand beside a big boy today, they aren't just looking at a locomotive, they're looking at the moment steam power said everything it had left to say in steel, fire, and motion. A giant that didn't just move freight, it moved the boundary of imagination.